With Place of Bones, if you watch the film, it starts out, it's very much a slow burn horror, a slow burn thriller. I mean, the entire first act and most of the second act is very much a three-hander. It's three people in a cabin talking. We wanted some way to sort of a building tension, a feeling of impending doom. You know, the proverbial train that's coming on the train track when the school bus is stalled on the train tracks around the corner. And part of the challenge for us was to find ways we could introduce that feeling of tension or of impending doom of this nameless, faceless monster, for lack of a better word, that we were going to run into in the second act.
Hi, I am Chad Anderson of Filmmaker U, filling in for Gordon Brickell. At Filmmaker U, we create courses for film professionals to deepen and diversify their skill set. You can learn more on filmmakeru.com or follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. Every week we interview a film professional, and this week we are pleased to be joined by editor Michael Mason, whose work has included numerous music videos, Cabin Fever Patient Zero, the Banana Splits movie, and most recently the Western Place of Bones. Welcome to the show, Michael. I really appreciate you being here and taking the time to talk to us a little bit. I'm always curious about how people get their start in film production or post-production in this case. What led you to becoming an editor? What was the really drive that motivated you there?
I'm actually a second generation film brat, so I had kind of an odd start in the industry. Nothing to do with post-production at all. I actually, my stepfather is a set painter, and so my first film set as a kid was actually First Blood, the original Rambo film. So I was a little kid, and he he brought me to set, and he was one of the painters who was working on it, and so I think for me, I always had a love for movies, and it was, I think because my stepfather's place in the business, it was something that was totally accessible to me, and so I immediately gravitated towards it, but I didn't really identify with the art department. And so I spent some time early on, working in the paint department, but I think I always had an intention to maybe move into production and actually sort of intended to direct. And so I actually started in music videos directing, and because I had a background in music video seemed a good place to start while I was going to film school, and I started making music videos. Along the way, I kind of discovered that, I had done some time doing camera department stuff, lighting and camera, and again, with sort of intentions of using that to move into directing. And I just kind of fell into post. It was something that happened by accident. I was working on a show, and it wasn't anything I was particularly interested in shooting, and an opportunity in post opened up, and I wanted to learn more about it, and I kind of fell into it, and it was like I found my home. I mean, I love the frenetic energy of being on set, but I think there's something about the, sitting there and putting all the pieces together, and I always say I'm sort of an introvert masked as an extrovert. So I think I'm well suited to sort of sit in a dark room by myself or with one other person, just kind of working through the story and trying to figure out the story beats that need to be there. And so it just was like I found home, and I've been doing it ever since. So.
I sort of got into VFX by accident. I always had a technical interest in photography, and especially as it relates to movie making. There's something magical about the ability to believe something is happening when it isn't. So I went as a live action producer into a company called Bob Abel and Associates. Then I would have to, have a meeting about how do we do this effect that's in this commercial, and I never got the straight answer I was looking for. I have camera knowledge, so it's like, since it's kind of ambiguous, why don't I just grab a camera and we'll try it out. You have to figure out what tells the story and use every trick in the book to solve your problem. I am Rob Legato, and this is my course on visual effects.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I was just on camping in in the mountains a little bit, and I was thinking about Rambo First Blood and how difficult it must have been, because there's a lot of that's in hills and woods and on set and being up there. It's just
The set that I visited by my stepfather, there's that whole cave sequence where he goes into the caves and then gets shut off, and the
yeah.
exterior of the cave was shot on location in Hope, British Columbia, just outside, about an hour and a half outside of Vancouver. But the interior of the cave was actually built out of foam and was done in a soundstage. And so he
Amazing.
was one of the painters who basically made the inside of the cave look like a real cave and not just a bunch of foam. So it was kind of interesting. I mean, for me as a kid, I got to visit a lot of sets, and he worked in the industry for years, and he's retired now, but he worked in the industry for years. And so over the years, I got to visit a lot of TV and film sets, and it was always kind of an eye opener. But I think more than anything for me, I grew up in Canada, and so I think it was it was a bridge to see what I see on the screen, and make it seem like a believable place where I could actually
Yeah.
earn a living.
Absolutely. Did you have a family that spent a lot of time making you watch movies? My family made me watch all kinds of movies, Hitchcock and Kubrick and Spielberg and everything else, and just inundated me with old John Ford movies and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up watching all sorts of movies. I have a fairly broad interest base in terms of the types of movies I watch. There's not really any genre that I don't like. But yeah, I grew up, my my family, even my stepfather, who fell into the film industry, actually had a degree in English literature. His his plan was to become an English professor, and there was no work when he got done school, and so he kind of fell into the film industry because he was actually a fine arts painter, and so it just kind of made sense. But my whole family are sort of readers, and so some of my fondest early memories as a kid was going to see movies with my parents. And I was also one of those kids who would somehow talk my parents into taking me to horror films, even though I was probably way too young to see them, and they would terrify me. But then I would, I would convince them the next time to take me again. And so I spent a lot of time watching movies that were probably, older, or above my head in terms of subject matter. But I think I discovered a deep love right from the beginning for film. So
my son is 11 years old right now, and he's in his horror movie phase. So I've been having to go see a lot of horror movies that I'm not really excited about, but he's really excited about. So he's definitely there with you. Speaking of which, I wanted to ask you about your ideas of crafting a story. You talk about your family being English professors. My wife is an English professor, and we often have conversations, me having a film background, have conversations about crafting a story. And she thinks of it as the screenplay. With a film like Place of Bones, how much freedom or independence did you have to craft the story in terms of the editing? Once you get into post-production, once you can say, hey, this is not working, or this needs to be redone, or this story is going in this direction, and we need to show more of this or less of this.
Place of Bones is an interesting situation for me, because it's a director, Audrey Cummings, who I've worked with for a long time. We both went to the Canadian Film Center, which is sort of the Canadian version of the AFI, that was started by Norman Jewison. And we met there, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. And so I've worked with her on 3 features, a number of TV, a whole bunch of short films. And I think because we spent a lot of time working together, I think we have a very good, strong sense of what each other, our sensibilities in terms of takes and performances, and how we want to approach things. So in some films you might have a closer discussion with the director prior to shooting. I'm usually assembling while they're shooting, hopefully a day behind, and so they may not get a chance to watch my dailies or my assembled scenes. And you don't necessarily get a lot of a time to have a conversation. But in Audrey's case, I think we've sort of developed a level of trust, and I think she sort of trusts me, and also knows that once we get into post-production, I'm perfectly happy to rip the whole editor's assembly apart and start from scratch and rebuild things if it's not quite what she was thinking. And we like to experiment and sort of run down every possible path anyway, with Place of Bones, one of the things we discovered very quickly was, if you watch the film, it starts out, it's very much a slow burn, a slow burn horror, a slow burn thriller. I mean, the entire first act and most of the second act is very much, a three-hander. It's three people in a cabin talking, and so we wanted,
waiting.
yeah, exactly, and we wanted some way to quickly introduce, sort of a building tension, a feeling of impending doom. The proverbial train that's coming, on the train tracks, when the school bus is stalled on the train tracks around the corner. And so we wanted to build this, but we also had a very, Audrey had right from the beginning a very strong sense of how she wanted to introduce the faces of the villains. And so the part of the challenge for us was to find, ways we could introduce that sort of feeling of tension or of impending doom of this nameless, faceless, monster, for lack of a better word, that we were going to run into in the second act, but introduce it early. And so a lot of what we did was play around with how to introduce them and when to introduce them and how to do it as early as possible, but without giving away a reveal of their faces. And so after I finished my first assembly, and we started sitting down together, a lot of what we spent time doing was figuring out ways to introduce them. And again, one of the other byproducts of it was a very contained movie at the beginning because a lot of it happened in this cabin. And so we wanted to introduce the sort of vastness of the territory around them and how isolated they were, because that's part of what sort of helps build the tension, is the fact that these two women are living out there alone with really no help. There's no sheriff to come running. There's nothing. So, and so that was part of it. And I think, Audrey sort of trusted me to play with that stuff early on. And then again, once we, sat down together, we really just started experimenting and finding, the right moments to bring them in.
It does take place with these three characters in this basically this shack of a house, and there is an impending villain, but it's only talked about really in the first act, and then we need to introduce them to see them to know the context. I think it's interesting because the not to give away any spoilers, but early on, the other two women that are captured by this group of marauders, whatever, really act as a catalyst to spell out that these people are villains, because otherwise they're just, some guys camping, and you create a sense of evil or a sense of villainy by the fact that these other women exist, that this is how they treat women and this is what they do to women. And so then it becomes this idea that this impending threat is more realistic because you see a contrast, or you see a context. You mentioned dailies before. I think dailies are really interesting because, as we transition away from traditional celluloid film, where it had to be developed and then you get to see it a day later, you can get content in a digital universe. You can get content almost immediately and continue to start working and editing. And it's not like there's a lengthy review session of watching film, I think, anymore. How did you deal with dailies and kind of the, like you said, assembly edits in the process?
Well, basically we had an on-set sort of team, a DIT and an assistant who were responsible on set for, for first of all taking all the footage from camera. It was shot, digitally, and so we shot on Alexa, and so they were taking all those files and obviously backing them up in triplicate, quadruplicate, whatever. They were backing everything up, but then the assistant would start syncing. And so at the end of the day, what I would get was basically, because I was working remotely, I was getting, a link to download to access all of those files, which at that point had been converted to Avid files. And the audio had been synced, and if there was any kind of multicam stuff where they shot to camera, hopefully then that stuff was grouped into cameras. And so I would get that footage at the end of the day. And so in some ways it was similar to a traditional workflow in that I was working about a day behind, and I was, sort of starting on the Tuesday on what was shot on the Monday and going through the footage. Now, of course, the director is off shooting the next day, and so I'm basically going through those takes alone. Oftentimes, because we have this working relationship, I have a pretty strong sense right from the beginning, just from watching the footage, of kind of what she was going for when I'm starting to put it together. But I also have access to her if I need to, call, or I can check in at lunch and sort of find out if there was a specific thing that she was trying. If I have questions about how she wanted to use a shot. But because it's digital, because we're not dealing with film, there's no like printing only the circled takes. I mean, basically I have access to all the footage, and I'm a pretty shameless thief in terms of stealing reaction shots or footage from anywhere. I think long ago I learned that any one shot is never more important than the entire film. And so whatever I have to do to help tell the story, if it's steal a shot from somewhere else, if it's, reframe a shot, reuse a shot. I know DPs hate it when you start blowing up and reframing things, because they spend so much time composing stuff. But I think that's sort of the reality of the world we live in now, especially when you're, often shooting, at 6 or 8K and then finishing at 2 or 4K. And so it does give you the ability to do things like digital pushes and to play around with framing and stuff to help tell the story, help create more tension, to create unbalance in a frame. And so sometimes we'll find ourselves reframing things or helping out by doing sort of slow pushes in on people. And that's the kind of thing I think that we're able to do now, in the digital world, fairly simply. So I spend a lot of time going through all of the takes, and with Audrey, just because of the way the two of us work, I kind of know in the back of my head that at some point we're going to go through, even if I've chosen what I think are the best takes, we're going to probably go through them again and look at them. So I have my own sort of process of how I put together string outs of scenes, just in terms of sort of building a string out, so that I have access to all of the takes later, and I can kind of create a duplicate of that timeline and start working from that, and then keep that original string out so I can go back and look at it with the director when I'm sitting down and working with them on
Sure.
rough cut, fine cut, so on.
Probably one of the smartest things I've ever done for my career. It gave me all the tools that I needed to be able to jump into a new career.
Getting myself into a mindset, thinking like an editor, and being around people that I can talk to on that level was really invaluable to me.
A lot of the things that I learned from that class, I still think about.
I loved the classroom. I loved the computer stations. We built a sense of community.
And it also instills a lot of confidence in you to take that and go out into the world.
After I took the class, I felt very prepared to take the next step.
I owe Manhattan Workshop the career that I have right now. Things have been going great, and I really have the Manhattan Workshop to thank for that.
It's really interesting the thing you said about the DP is because it is an interesting world that we live in right now with the digital, realm we have, because, you're shooting in 6K, 8K, sometimes even bigger, with these new cameras, and you can punch in because you might be delivering in 2K or, God forbid, HD. You have these abilities, and then simultaneously we're telling DPs, classically, hey, get a nicely composed image with good color in this thing, or shoot raw and we'll do it and we'll fix it all in post with color correction, and shoot flat and we'll fix so it's taking a little bit of the creativity, and you coming from a background of being involved in producing and shooting, it's a weird wrestling match between the DPs who want to have this creative ideas of doing stuff in a creative way, and it's no, shoot it big and flat and we'll fix it later.
Yeah, and I mean, I think with this film, part of the challenge was, in terms of those scenes shot in the cabin, is Andre Andre Sakula, who was the DP, and Audrey were really limited in what they could shoot. I mean, they built the cabin. It had it had the ability to move things around because it was built from scratch, and the art department did a fabulous job, creating this sort of rustic cabin. But it is still a challenge in terms of blocking scenes and figuring out different ways of shooting, the same set over and over and over again without sort of making it boring. So I think that was a challenge that they sort of rose to, because I think one of the things we tried to do was use the opportunity, even though we're sort of in the same set. We've got stuff in the deep background, things that are giving a little clue here or there to who these women are, and the fact that they're living in this sort of isolated place by themselves. And so I think it was an opportunity to kind of show off some of the art department.
It's an interesting story, because as a Western, you think about the big open wide space, the Western expansion, wide angle shots, but then most of the film takes place in a small room that's encapsulated in there, and so it's kind of confined, and the story lends to that of they're kind of isolated, they're separated from the rest of the world. She's left her father, and they're all alone without a male figure who's passed away, and they're in a small space, but they're in this great giant wilderness of the uncivilized West. It's an interesting idea.
Even in the location itself, they're sort of at the bottom of a canyon, so they're almost surrounded by sort of hills, and they're kind of at the bottom. So I mean, inside they're obviously in this sort of small enclosed space in the cabin, but even their ranch house itself is kind of enclosed in this little valley. So it was interesting to try and figure out different ways of approaching a scene in that room, the sort of one room cabin, to try and make it different all the time, so we're not just seeing the same things.
To not give anything away, but there is a twist ending, and there is a kind of a shocking twist to the ending that I didn't see coming, and I was there through the film, and I'm like, okay, this is standard Western, and then there's a hard twist there, a hard turn there. In editing that from an ending perspective, there's a clever balance of giving enough away that the audience or the viewer should have seen or could have seen or could have thought something was amiss, but not giving too much away that you spoon feed it to them. Is it difficult to balance that by saying, hey, we're going to include this scene, but we're not going to include this, or she's going to say this, but she's not going to say this, and I don't want to give away too much, but I want to make a point of this, to not hand it over to the audience, but also leave it that it was possible, potential is there, not like it was just made up at the end?
For sure. I mean, one of the things, I sort of believe strongly, just in terms of editing a movie or telling a story, is that oftentimes things, which seem, when you're reading them on a script, seem like they're not obvious, when you see them, in a film, in a scene that's cut together, become very obvious. And so, I mean, Richard Taylor, who wrote the script, did a great job of sort of holding that back. But when we sat down and looked at it, I mean, there were definitely things here and there that we felt we needed to pull back on to not give away too much. We wanted to drop those nuggets. I'm a big rewatcher of films. I love, watching a film a second time, especially something where there is some kind of a twist, or there's you find out information later on that changes, your perspective from the beginning. I love to rewatch those films, and if they're well done, you start picking up on some of the nuances early on that were dropped that you didn't necessarily notice, but after you know whatever the twist is, the classic one is something like Sixth Sense, where once you figured out he's dead, you go back and you rewatch it, and suddenly things start to make sense because you're looking at it from different perspectives. So I think we definitely had those moments we had to pull back on. And interestingly, we still weren't 100% sure what was being done with the ending. So it was actually shot sort of 3 different ways, and we kind of played with the ending that's in there is the ending that we always wanted, but we didn't know how it was going to play when the whole film played together. We didn't want to create unlikable characters, and so we had to spend a little bit of time thinking about it and in the end, we did end up with the ending that we liked, that we wanted from the beginning, but it was, a little. There was a little bit of decision making and trying to figure out what made sense. So,
in terms of this being a Western, Westerns are still done, but they're not done as prolifically as they were in, the past 50s and 60s. Did you find inspirations from other Westerns that you had grown up with, that you had seen, that you would like? Did you have some kind of aspiration of something you wanted to achieve in terms of making a Western?
Yeah, I mean, I think lately there's been a few really good sort of what I would call sort of hybrid, subgenre Westerns, horror, thriller, sort of Western hybrids. Things like Bone Tomahawk and Old Henry and Hostiles pop to mind. But I kind of grew up, loving Westerns as a kid. I used to read, Marvel had a whole series of comic books that were Western themed, things like Kid Colt and the Two Gun Kid, and so I actually grew up reading all of those, as a kid, and I loved movies like The Long Riders, and of course there's some great classics, but I typically loved the sort of grittier, like the Magnificent Seven, the kind of grittier, doomed characters, the sort of protagonists that are, the protagonists that are not really, they're not really heroes. Yeah, they're not like the clean, shiny heroes. They're the stories of redemption and the sort of bad guys who kind of fell into being a bad guy, but really, aren't sort of evil. They're not just, all out evil. And that's sort of what this was in terms of, Calhoun. This is kind of his story of redemption. Like when we first meet him, he's an interesting character because certainly when we first learn of the real villains, the Bear John and his gang, we learn about them through him, and he's an unreliable narrator through the whole thing because he's he's a liar and a thief, and you don't know what you can believe. And it's not until the sort of scene that you talked about where we introduce them at the campfire scene, and there's those two women there. That's when we kind of get to see it for our, with our own eyes. And I think before that, there are these kind of mythic people. You don't know if he's exaggerating because he's a bit of a storyteller and his stories change, or is he telling the truth? And I think by the end of the film, he's it's been a sort of a story of his redemption. He ends up, coming to the aid of these two women and trying to help Pandora and her daughter survive. And so I think that sort of gritty, dark kind of Western that's more realistic. They're not pretty. It's not like a 50s sort of clean, sanitized Western is something that's always interested me. So,
yeah, I think it's interesting because you mentioned Calhoun. Calhoun is villainous and corrupt and there, but I think it's more so by their standards, by Pandora and Hester's standards. They come across in the introduction as these holier than thou, speak proper, praise God for everything. And so by their perspective, if you're introduced to the film by their perspective, they come in as these these perfect people of goodness. And so anything he lied, and that's, but by most Westerns, characters lie all the time. Clint Eastwood would lie all the time, whatever it may be. But now we have the contrast of them versus him, and he just becomes, by normal standards, okay, he's a thief. Yeah, that's in 1,000 Westerns. There's been people robbing banks. Yeah, but he's now in their camp, and their camp makes him, the most horrific thing that they've ever experienced or something because of their disposition, and because of, exposition we get about them. I do want to ask this last question while we wrap up here, and this is just a kind of a personal one. Do you have any guilty pleasures? Some things you watch for fun, movies or TV at the end of a long day just to relax? Something you're maybe a little embarrassed about or a little silly?
I mean, I don't know if I'm necessarily embarrassed about it, but I'm certainly a consumer of sort of, you know, food porn, you know, those sort of those cooking shows that you'd see on Food Network, you know, things like Chopped and stuff like that. I'm not a bad chef, but I'm sorry, I'm not a bad cook. I'm not a chef. I'm not trained or anything, but I think I definitely you know, I definitely like sort of watching these, you know, interesting creations that people come up with on the spot. And I'm also a big consumer. I've always liked teen comedies, which you know, I think oftentimes people view as sort of very superficial and, oh, it's just a silly teen comedy. But I've always sort of found like high school and being a teenager is kind of it's like a microcosm of what the world's going to be like when you're older, except everything just is so much bigger when you're a teenager, you know. Like, I think you're, you know, your friend you know, betrays you doing something stupid, you know, and it suddenly becomes this monumental thing. Or, you know, the girl you asked to prom doesn't, you know, say yes and goes with your, you know, your enemy instead. And there's something about it that I think is sort of speaks to the larger, you know, stories that we live in life, but it gives you, you know, this smaller kind of, you know, universe to so I think they're often written off as something silly, but I think there's some great ones that are I would say guilty pleasures that I probably rewatched quite a few times.
Well, I think, yeah, I think it's interesting because I was just talking about this with some students of mine about how we can look at great films, you know, The Godfather, you know, Citizen Kane, whatever it may be, but these films, these teen comedies or these teen films, these 80s teen movies for me, they are a time capsule. They do have, you know, a place in history as a film because they represent, you know, what the 16-year-old version of you was going through at the time, and they will outlast most of these, you know, critically acclaimed films because they're us at that most vulnerable time of ourselves. And so they do have, you know, a benchmark in history of, you know, I'm never gonna forget Breakfast Club or Pretty in Pink or whatever it may be, because they represent who I was at that time. So yeah, I think they're important
they're
films.
at a point in our life where we're kind of molding who we're going to become, or trying to find that, and they're part of our journey to that place where, so even though they seem silly and superficial, I think they often are about, you know, universal human emotions that, you know, and struggles that we're all going through, and we all kind of understand that. So
yeah, and you can probably look back at them and look at how you turned into the person you turned into, like how you,
oh, for sure,
like, yeah, how what catalyst made you not like, you know, these bullies or something like that. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, Michael. It's been a really
it's been fun.
It's been a good time. That's gonna be it for us this week. You can check us out at filmmakeru.com, or again, follow us on Instagram at filmmaker_u. I am Chad Anderson. Thank you again, Michael Mason, and thank you so much everyone else for watching.